Hi, this is Chris Young. Welcome to episode 87 of Contemplating Life. I've never engaged in what you might call hero worship, where I become infatuated with someone who's accomplished great things or promotes the values that are in tune with my own. I have, however, become a fan of many famous, talented people, an admirer of people who value what I value. Unfortunately, these days, all too often, we're discovering that the people we admire are not who they seem to be. When I was a preteen, I got my first record player. My first record was not the Beatles or Elvis. It was a Bill Cosby comedy album, Why Is There Air? And much of my storytelling comes from studying Cosby's routines. When I learned that he had drugged and sexually assaulted many women, I felt like I had been betrayed by a good friend, even though I didn't know him personally, and only had the privilege of seeing him perform live one time. I mourn the loss of never seeing another film or TV show starring Kevin Spacey, and I wonder what type of cinematic masterpieces we are not seeing produced because Harvey Weinstein is no longer in the movie business. Both of these men have been revealed to be sexual predators. One of the greatest and most beloved science fiction writers of my life, Isaac Asimov, is reported to have routinely groped women at public events, even though his misogynistic activities never rose to the level of someone like Cosby. There's no evidence he ever actually had sex with any of his victims. He just mistreated and disrespected women greatly. The list of people who've been canceled because of their aberrant behavior seems to grow at an ever-increasing rate as their victims have finally found the courage to step forward. Occasionally, I find it possible to separate the art from the artist. I can still laugh at an old Cosby routine. I think Mel Gibson is a talented actor, as well as an outstanding filmmaker, even though he has expressed anti-Semitic views. I'm not going to stop being a Harry Potter fan because his creator is anti-trans. But there are limits as to how far one can take that. Fans of this podcast, and people who know me, know that I'm a technology nerd and a fan of science fiction and a fan of real-life space travel. I grew up during the space race. In a previous episode, I told the story of watching Alan Shepard become the first American to travel into space, watching coverage on TV in my kindergarten class, and my idiot classmates who complained that Captain Kangaroo had been preempted. I was a huge Captain Kangaroo fan, but he couldn't hold a candle to a real-life spaceman. As a politically progressive person who worries about the environment, and as a technology fan, naturally I'm a big proponent of fully electric vehicles. So as you might have guessed by now, I was a big fan of Elon Musk. Just prior to the pandemic, I owned a few shares of Tesla. I purchased them when the price of gas was approaching $5 per gallon. I thought with gas running that high, electric vehicles would be in great demand. Unfortunately, right about that time, Musk purchased Twitter, and Wall Street didn't approve, for good reasons. When the pandemic hit and the demand for gas dropped, that further put downward pressure on Tesla's stock. Fortunately, the stock eventually rebounded, and I was able to get out at about the same price as I got in. I've always had some reservations about Musk the man. However, I just thought he was a nerdy, eccentric billionaire whose idiosyncrasies were part of his job and the mystique surrounding him. It wasn't until the Twitter purchase that I really began to have serious reservations about the man. Still, I just chalked it up to his eccentricity. I rarely, if ever, put out a tweet, and the only people I follow are people who reliably report about the space program, maybe a few race drivers, and a few progressive journalists. I have no difficulty avoiding all the controversy and toxicity on Twitter. I've always believed that social media is what you make of it. Sure, the algorithm tries to seal you in a bubble of your own making, but I see myself as a critical thinker. I simply avoid the idiots who are not. If Musk destroyed Twitter, it wasn't going to change my life one bit, so I didn't really care. I don't recall Musk being a factor in the first Trump campaign or administration, and didn't particularly bother me when he became active in the 2024 Trump campaign. I just presumed he was an opportunist who picked what he thought would be the winning side, and he was going to play Trump for the fool that he is. I didn't like it, but it didn't bother me much. Naturally, I was fearful that Trump might win again. I knew that if he did, it would be worse this time. I was mostly concerned about the authors of Project 2025. It seemed like Musk was just a flamboyant, large campaign donor. In my view, it was just Musk being Musk. And as with other celebrities, I found a way to separate the art from the artist. In this case, the art is his engineering skill. He continues to make phenomenal progress in battery technology for his vehicles. And while I'll always remain skeptical about the future of self-driving cars, I do find it fascinating that the technology has progressed as far as it has. I'm watching carefully, but skeptically. Now, as far as SpaceX goes, I could not be happier that the Americans are riding American-made rockets into space again. I marvel at the technology that he can return and reuse the first stage of his Falcon 9 rockets. And I closely follow the progress of the Starship Heavy Booster Development Program. I've seen every Starship test flight live on YouTube. I frequently watch Falcon 9 launches, even though they're occurring at a rate of about a couple a week. I don't get tired of that. The idea that he can catch the lower stage of Starship with a pair of chopstick arms on the launch tower just amazes me. Much of my admiration for Musk derives from an extensive interview with space journalist Tim Dodd in the summer of 2021. Dodd goes by the online name The Everyday Astronaut. His YouTube channel's catchphrase is, "Bringing space down to Earth for everyday people." He's an amazing science communicator. Anyway, if you watch Dodd interview Musk as they take a walking tour through the SpaceX Starbase production facility in Boca Chica, Texas, you immediately become aware of how hands-on Musk is in the engineering. He knows the details inside and out and actively participates in design decisions both at SpaceX and at Tesla. Now, in this interview that I've linked in the description, you'll probably find much of the discussion over your head. And I was only able to follow it a little bit because of technical details that Dodd has covered in excellent mini-documentaries on how rocket engines work. At about the 13:30 mark of the interview, Musk outlines a 5-step plan for effective project engineering. I've watched the interview many, many times. I'm still in awe of how ingenious this outline is for engineering problem solving. Briefly, here are the 5 steps. Step 1. Make the design requirements less dumb. He points out that in engineering school, you're given a homework assignment. You have to engineer some widget, but you don't get to challenge the requirements. You have to build the widget that was assigned to you. However, in real life, you should always challenge the design requirements. He believes that the most dangerous requirements are made by the really smart people, because you are less likely to challenge them. He encourages you to challenge the design requirements regardless of where they came from. Now, while I don't particularly agree that smart people are more likely to have dumb requirements, I understand his point that you should challenge everything, think independently, and not just take people's word for it because they're allegedly experts. He concludes by saying, everybody's wrong some of the time. Step 2. The best part is no part. He gives an example of the grid fins that sit atop the Super Heavy booster. These fins guide the rocket through the atmosphere as it comes in for a landing. On his other rockets, the fins fold up during a launch and are only extended during re-entry. But on this larger rocket, the weight of the mechanism to unfold the fins would cost you more in fuel than the drag of leaving the fins open throughout the flight. So it's better to leave the fins in the extended position and delete the folding mechanism. He summarizes this step with a particularly haunting sentence that we'll reveal at the end of this discussion. Step 3. Simplify or optimize the process. Musk explains that engineers too often waste time on optimizing a part that has bad design requirements from step 1 and may not be necessary at all as in step 2. Step 4. Accelerate the cycle time. If you're doing something too slowly, find a way to do it faster. And number 5, automate the process. Earlier in the discussion, he says engineering how to manufacture an item can be 100 times more difficult than engineering the product itself. It's easy to design and build one item. It's hard to design a method to create thousands of that item efficiently. Musk summarizes these 5 steps by explaining a situation where he performed them in the exact opposite order. It perfectly illustrates the genius of these steps. They are not something born out of ideology or philosophy. The steps are born out of real-world experience in which he performed the steps in the wrong order. Here's the example he gives. There were these fiberglass mats on the Tesla Model 3 that sat on the top of the battery pack and were sandwiched between the battery pack and the floor of the car. The installation of these mats was slowing down the entire production line. He personally spent significant time trying to automate this process. He tried to optimize the path that the assembly robots would take in installing the mats. He tried using less glue because the glue only needed to hold the mat in place until the battery pack was bolted in. Finally, he asked the battery people, "Why do we even need these mats? Are they for heat protection or fire suppression?" The battery people said, no, it's for sound suppression. Then he asked the sound experts why we need the mats. And they said, no, it's for fire protection. Ultimately, they concluded it was not a thermal protection issue. So they tested the vehicle sound levels with and without the mats and found no measurable difference. They got rid of the mats altogether, all because they had tried to automate, accelerate, and optimize an unnecessary part based on bad original design criteria. At the time I watched the interview, and still today, I think this is an example of engineering genius that I greatly admire. It goes further than that. In November 2022, I wrote an essay for my blog in which I tried to apply some of the lessons learned from these 5 steps in my quest to become a better writer. While steps 3 through 5 don't particularly apply to creating fiction, I realized I was failing at the first 2 steps. In the essay, which I've linked in the description, I explained I was skipping step 2. I was too long-winded. I also suffered from dumb design requirements. Some of my stories have very high concept, but I get so busy trying to serve that design concept that I forget to tell a compelling story along the way. For example, I recently withdrew a story from my anthology when I realized that my design criteria for the work were a bit dumb and unfocused. In spite of everything, I still admire the man for those insights. One might easily conclude that the man who would have such insight into efficiency would be the best person to try to fix what's wrong with our undoubtedly inefficient federal government. But there's a problem. The government is not rocket science. People aren't rockets or cars. People and their jobs are not parts that can be deleted. The solution to our administrative issues is not an engineering problem. In explaining step 2, Musk reveals in this interview from nearly 4 years ago everything that is wrong with his alleged Department of Government efficiency. In explaining step 2, he says,
basically, if you're not adding things back in 10% of the time, you're clearly not deleting enough.
Right.
If you're not adding things back in 10% of the time, clearly you're not deleting enough. Now you know why Doge has to repeatedly attempt to rehire people who should not have been fired in the first place. This has been part of his philosophy of efficiency all along. And in the case of the Doge firings, I'd say he's doing it a lot more than 10% of the time. They deleted the grid fin folding mechanism from the Super Heavy booster. Musk commented that if they later conclude we have to put them back in, it's no big deal. But you see, the grid fin folding mechanisms don't have families to feed, rent to pay, or medical expenses. It's just a big hunk of metal. It doesn't hurt if you take it out. It doesn't hurt if you put it back in. After much thought, I've concluded the problem is not this 5-step model of efficiency. The problem is Musk is violating his own rules, especially step 1. His design criteria are dumb. His job, as he sees it, is to make government more efficient at any cost. He's oblivious to the human toll of his arbitrary decision-making. People are not parts. When he deleted the fiberglass mats from the Tesla Model 3, he first sought the opinions of the experts who designed the battery compartment, and he determined it was not a fire suppression issue. Then he conferred with the noise reduction experts, and they did not believe it was a noise reduction issue. But before he took their word for it, they ran tests to see if deleting the fiberglass mats made a difference in the sound levels. And they only deleted the mats after they concluded that they were completely unnecessary. If Elon Musk would simply stick to his principles, as outlined in the Tim Dodd interview, he might actually be doing a good job of making our government work more efficiently. Now, don't get me wrong. I agree that Musk is putting his own interests above that of the government and the American people in most instances. He's targeting agencies that regulate his activities, and the Trump administration is helping him to do so. He's not a good guy, but he is a good engineer, and there are things about his engineering principles that we can learn from. If he would stick to those principles and somehow develop a sense of empathy for the consequences of his decisions, he might be doing the nation a great service. I want our government to be more efficient. I want our government to work better. And I wish someone would go in and shake things up and make it better. But unfortunately, that's not what is happening here. There's nothing inherently admirable or despicable about Cosby, Spacey, Weinstein, Asimov, Gibson, Rawling, or Musk. For all of these people, at one point or another, I've greatly admired some of their work, and I still do. They're simply ordinary, flawed human beings, in degrees great and small, as we all are. I admired these people for their work and or their artistry, which at times reaches the level of genius. But when they violate their own principles, and my principles, that's where we must part company. Cosby isn't the wholesome family man that he portrayed. Making Professor Dumbledore gay doesn't absolve Rowling of her harmful transphobic rhetoric. Musk's development of technology that has the potential to save our environment and to preserve the human race by making us multiplanetary isn't going to mean anything if he destroys our democracy. If Trump and Musk and their enablers are not stopped, our system of government, of the people, by the people, and for the people, will not long endure. In future episodes, I plan to go back to the topic of religion, although I may do some more political topics before then. As previously reported, I taught Catholic inquiry classes for 30 years. I've decided to turn some of those lesson plans into podcast episodes, occasionally expanding and revising my material to incorporate new insights and new information I've gathered since I quit teaching many years ago. I also have the freedom in this format to expound more deeply on some of the topics than I had when I was trying to squeeze all of my information into one evening class. As always, when I discuss religion, I'm not trying to convert or proselytize or evangelize anyone. I'm just sharing my story, sharing knowledge that I hope you'll find interesting. Maybe it'll give you some insights into how religious people really believe. My purpose, as always, is to make this podcast educational, entertaining, enlightening, or even inspiring. If you want to support that, please consider sponsoring me on Patreon for just $5 per month. You get early access and other exclusive content. I'm not in this for the money, but every little bit helps. As always, my deepest thanks to my financial supporters. That means more to me than words can express. And if you can't provide financial support, share some links. I just want people to hear my stories. All my back episodes are available, so check those out. If you have any comments, questions, or other feedback, please feel free to comment on any of the platforms where you found the podcast. I'll see you next time as we continue contemplating a life. Fly safe, everyone.